Hey, faithful listener. Thanks for tuning in to the P40 Ministries Daily Podcast. This podcast is dedicated to helping you grow spiritually so you can grow personally. Let's grow together by building a consistent Bible reading routine. This is Jen, your host, and today we will be discussing the book of Exodus. Hey, good morning, friends and faithful listeners. Thank you for tuning in to the P40 Ministries podcast. And I have a guest with me today. This is Liz Wann, and I told you guys a little bit about her a few days ago when I mentioned I would be having some guests on the podcast. And actually, a couple weeks back, I don't know if you guys remember this, I found an article online that I really liked, and it was a Desiring God article, and it was written by Liz Wann, and I mentioned it on the podcast as, God being good but not being safe is what I was talking about for that day. And I mentioned that article. And so I liked the article so much that I actually dropped a link to it in the bio of that podcast episode. And I went to go find the author. And this is her. So she's here joining us today, and she's going to be talking a little bit about Exodus 31 with me today. And, but I would like for her to actually introduce herself. So Liz, tell the audience of the P40 Ministries podcast a little bit about yourself and some of the various things that you've been doing.
Yeah. Well, I live in the city of Philadelphia, married with 3 kids. I've been writing for a few years just for various online Christian ministries and publications. But recently I had my first book published in March, a book on motherhood called The End of Me with the Good Book Company. And besides writing, most of my time is spent homeschooling my children. So
nice. So tell me a little bit more about your book and what the premise of it is.
Yeah, it's called The End of Me because it's about how just motherhood can drive us to the end of ourselves. I mean, obviously many things can drive us to the end of ourselves, but it's more the perspective of being a mom and how that there's just many daily deaths to ourselves, but how God uses those deaths for just producing the fruit of resurrection in our hearts.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of translates over to your kids a little bit too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're working on me too. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you can find that book on Amazon, and I will drop a link to that in the show notes of this podcast episode. Also, you can find Liz and some of her writings at lizwann.com, which is what I will also drop that link as well. But let's go ahead and talk about Exodus chapter 31 today, verses 1 through 18. This is actually the entire chapter that I'll be reading here. So it's going to be quite a bit of reading, but there's a lot to talk about. And I think it'll be a really good episode with Liz here. She's going to help me answer some questions and talk about this today. So let's go ahead and read this. As I usually do, I'll be reading out the WEB version of the Bible this morning. Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Behold, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. I have filled him with the Holy Spirit of God, in wisdom and in understanding and in knowledge and in all kinds of workmanship, to devise skillful works, to work in gold and in silver and in bronze, and in cutting of stones for setting, and in carving of wood, to work with all kinds of workmanship. Behold, I myself have appointed him with Oholiab, the son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan, and in the heart of all those who are wise-hearted I have put wisdom, that they may make all that I have commanded you: the tent of meeting, the ark of the covenant, the mercy seat that is on it, and all the furniture of the tent, the table and its vessels, the pure lampstand with all of its vessels, the altar of incense, the altar of burnt offering and all of its vessels, the basin and its base, and the finely worked garments, the holy garments for Aaron the priest, the garments of his sons to minister in the priest's office, the anointing oil and the incense of sweet spices for the holy place. According to all that I have commanded you, they shall do. Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak also to the children of Israel, saying, Most certainly you shall keep my Sabbaths, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am Yahweh who sanctifies you. You shall keep the Sabbath therefore, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among its people. 6 days shall work be done, but on the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to Yahweh. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death. Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations, for a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed. When he finished speaking with him on Mount Sinai, he gave Moses the 2 tablets of the covenant, stone tablets, written with God's finger. So Liz, what stood out to you the most regarding this portion of Scripture?
I think just how important rest is to God. I thought it was interesting, and I kind of wrestled with this, and I can't say I 100% have the answer. So I'd like to hear what you say or what even the listeners think. But, and I looked at different translations, but where it even says that on the 7th day, after, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, that he rested and was refreshed. I think the word refreshed really stuck out to me. Just me asking questions. Cause usually I would believe doctrinally that God doesn't need anyone or anything, that he's self-sufficient. But, the only thing that I could come up with was he doesn't need to work either. He's kind of showing that he doesn't need to do that either. And it doesn't need to be all the time. Yeah. So I just thought that actually just more produced questions in me. So why the word refreshed? But just even realizing that it is important to the Lord. It's written in his law. So it's very important. And he modeled it for us, no matter how refreshed looks and what that means. He modeled it for us.
But even Jesus needed his rest. We've been going through the book of Mark, and we keep seeing how Jesus was like retreating off to places to just have some relaxation time with himself. So yes, clearly, if God needed it, we certainly needed it. If Jesus needed it, we certainly need it as well. But that is an interesting question, I think, that you bring up, is that concept of refreshment. I'd actually like to talk about verses 1 through 11 here. So what was so significant about God's Spirit being given to the craftsmen in verses 1 through 11, do you think?
I think it just shows, just to like kind of backtrack, it kind of made me think of, again, growing up in the church. I grew up in the church. I feel like a lot of Christians in general tend to separate into categories like things that are sacred and things that are secular, and don't always see where they might bleed together, or even the categories themselves might be like erroneous. And I think usually like they're talking about like craftsmen and people who are artists, and usually I feel like that would be put in the secular category. Like, these are secular things. They don't have to do with the Bible, and they don't have to do with Jesus. But here we do see something. I know this was something special because the tabernacle, what it stood for, what it meant, it was very important because it was signifying the coming of Christ and how he would tabernacle with us. And even giving a picture of the heavenly places. Remember how it was like set up to kind of mimic heaven and the presence of God. So I know it was something specific to this time and in context. But just even the fact that there would be something, and so that's why, I ultimately I would think that's why the Lord's Spirit was on them, because of what the tabernacle represents and what it signifies, and it is something divine. But I do think that it is interesting, this melding of what we would think of as secular, what we might think of as secular, and of the world, arts and crafts, but then how the Spirit is there and makes it divine as well. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. And, I completely agree with that, because I think that some Christians have a tendency to like think that because they're not doing like ministry type of work, they can't like add God into their work or something. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it doesn't have to be. I agree with you. Yeah, I see that as well, where that sacred and secular like divide, there's a huge chasm between it. Whereas like you're not doing ministry unless you're a pastor or you're a pastor's wife or whatever, some kind of a missionary, but I think that even what we would label as secular, even though I don't think it has to be, is anything that we do, working with our hands. Jesus did. He was a carpenter. He's our Savior, was a carpenter. So, he can there can be something that we use it all for the glory of God.
Yeah,
And how
exactly.
we do it.
Mm-hmm.
The Spirit can be part of it.
Yeah. I used to be a hairdresser.
Okay. Yeah.
It was a very secular job, but it was cool though, because sometimes I could have conversations with my my clients every once in a while.
Yeah.
So like there's always something that you can, some sort of ministry aspect of, that you can integrate into your work, whatever that might be. So I mean, I do think that there's always something you can do to sort of add that ministry aspect into your job, whatever that might
definitely.
be. One thing that stood out to me actually about this is regarding the whole like Sabbath and this like work. I think it's interesting that God tells them to take a Sabbath. He's like, yes, do good work, and I'm gonna put my my Spirit on you so that you can accurately follow these descriptions and everything. But take that Sabbath day of rest. Don't get so caught up in what you're doing that you don't actually rest and relax. So why do you think God was so adamant about keeping the Sabbath? Do you think? I mean, we kind of touched on that a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
But what do you think about that?
I guess, I mean, when I think of, I've been thinking about it, I would assume that the Sabbath is very important because it's a time to connect with God and to connect with others, which is kind of what the law is about. And Jesus even says that the whole of the law can be summed up in love God and neighbor. And so it's like, if we want to love God and neighbor, then we have to be invested in Sabbath rest, if we're going to do that well, and not be running around crazy and in this, depending on what's going on in our heart, either a posture of just anxiety or pride or whatever's driving us in our work that's driving us mad. And not realizing that even in that, we're not having a Sabbath rest. Sometimes it's just the disposition of our heart, of like, that is not Sabbath rest in my heart. And why I'm doing my work, so I think it's a way to, just to be able to connect with God and just better be able to love him and love others. And he must know that.
Yeah, that's very true, because I mean, man, you just blew my mind a little bit, because when we're working, I mean, sometimes it's for our families and stuff, but sometimes work can be very, not always, but sometimes our work can be very self-centered because we want to, push forward, we want to move forward and reach new heights and stuff like that. Like even me with the podcast, like I have to chill out a little bit sometimes. And, we think of it sometimes as self-centered, trying to get that next promotion or whatever. Mm-hmm. And, when we take that Sabbath day of rest, we can stop thinking about like ourselves a little bit and start thinking about other people, because even Jesus did that in the temples and stuff when he was healing on the Sabbath day. And, he was thinking about other people, and he said that it's okay to think about other people, when the Pharisees were just like, no, you can't do anything for anybody, basically, on the Sabbath day.
Too legalistic.
Yes, a little bit. And so, so Jesus was always thinking about other people on the Sabbath day even. And so I think that is important. So Liz, you blew my mind, that's one of the reasons why we should take a Sabbath day, is to think about other people. And, that's pretty interesting. But so why do you think God would command such a harsh punishment for those who didn't keep the Sabbath?
That's exactly what I was thinking when I first read it. Mm-hmm. I mean, my thoughts is just like mulling it over and meditating on it. I can just share my thoughts. And I feel like I don't have all like these might not be the right answers, but these are my thoughts. I do think that there is something interesting. The first punishment, right, was that it had to do almost with community. It was like, you're going to be cast out of the community. That was like almost like there were two punishments, right? Mm-hmm. There was one that was like death.
Yeah.
And then there was one that was like, you're just going to be cut off from everyone. And I'm kind of the one about being cut off, it kind of made me think, like that's kind of in other portions, parts of the Bible, it talks about God giving people over, to their sinful ways and what they've already chosen. They're already running the opposite direction. So it kind of makes me think whoever is being cut off, I would view that as more, it's something passive. It's like what we would call like neglect. they're neglecting something important for themselves. And so it's kind of like they're already cutting, by their neglect, they're already cutting off themselves, really, essentially, from the people of God and from God himself, and they're not engaging in Sabbath. And so I guess I kind of viewed it as it's like God just giving them up. They already are doing that.
Right.
If you're already kind of cutting yourself off and neglecting it, then we're going to give you up to it. And so see you later, you know? And so it's like, that's the choice that they have made. You're just admitting that's their choice now. So then when you think about that, it doesn't seem, I guess, maybe as brutal. Now I know the death seems brutal, but what I thought was interesting though, and like I said, I don't have all the answers for what this might mean, but, is when it talked about the death, it was saying if you use the word, it's different than what it talked about with cutting and being cut off from community. It was profaning the Sabbath. I noticed a difference. There was a distinction being made between these two. And so I kind of viewed it as, okay, the other one was more like passive, like neglect. This one is more active. It is abuse. Like when you look up the definition of profane, it has abuse in it. It's like some kind of action. It's to treat something sacred with abuse, irreverence, or contempt. So there's something like you're actively abusing, and I don't understand what they were doing, like in that context and historically, like what were they doing actually to profane the Sabbath? But I guess even without those details, we can still know that sounds a lot worse, right? Profaning, and there's something, obviously they were desecrating something sacred. And then when you think about that, it might not seem so harsh, maybe that, that there was death involved from that.
Yeah, I like that a lot. One thing I mentioned on the podcast a couple days ago, I think it was eventually after the tabernacle was built, there was a guy that came in and I think it was early on, pretty much right after the temple was built, there was a dude that came in with this foreign girl, and they were having sex in front of something.
Oh, okay. That could be the profaning the Sabbath. Yeah. Okay,
yeah. There was a story about that. And that guy and the girl both died. One of the priests ran them through with a spear because that was so that profaned the tabernacle so much. And that's God's house. That's where he lived. I mean, can you imagine some random person coming into your house and doing that on your couch? I mean, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah. Well, we'd call the cops.
Oh yeah, we'd call the cops.
What we do.
Man,
yeah.
I mean, I don't know. But that's kind of where I'm thinking now a little bit, now that you mentioned that, is just that profaning of the Sabbath day just goes very deep, and
Yes, yeah. You could see it, the consequence does match it, whereas before it was kind of you're just giving them up. This one is okay. You see how it matches up.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for shining some light onto that. So one more question for you. Let's see here. So how does the Sabbath here in Exodus 31 tie into what Jesus says in Mark 2:21 through 28?
I think that what stuck out to me was in verse 27, where Jesus, it says, then he said to them, it's Jesus talking, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. I feel like he's kind of giving us the key there of, to not be like like we're talking about just a little earlier, the Pharisees just took everything so far. They're going by the letter of the law. The Bible talks about down to every dotting and crossing of every T and dotting of every I. And God that's not what the intention of the Sabbath was. So it's kind of like he's saying, that's not the heart of the Sabbath. The heart of the Sabbath, it was made for you. It was made for man. It was something for you. And interestingly enough, I do think and then he says, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So I think he's kind of saying to the Pharisees, you're missing the point of the Sabbath. And look, I am the point of the Sabbath. I am the Sabbath. I am the Sabbath rest. It's right in front of you. I feel like he came to fulfill that. And that's what he's kind of telling them here. Even I am the Lord of the Sabbath. You're missing it, and it's me.
As I was thinking about that passage from Mark, we've gone through the book of Mark a little bit on this podcast, and we talked about that passage quite a while ago. But as I was reading it and comparing it to Exodus 31, when I was researching for this episode, I was thinking about it, and God keeps saying you all throughout this passage. So he's talking about how the Sabbath is good for you, not that you have to do it for God, kind of how like the Pharisees thought of it as. But like even for here in verse 13, that the Sabbath, it says here in verse 13 of Exodus 31, that the Sabbath is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am Yahweh who sanctifies you. And then it says in verse 14 that the Sabbath is holy to you. So he keeps using that word you, not that it's like for God that we're doing this stuff, but that it's actually good for us. And that we shouldn't be profaning it in any way because it's holy. It's a holy day that God sanctified us. And, so I think that that's kind of interesting that it does line up with Mark chapter 2. But the Pharisees, back then they wanted to kind of make everything bigger than what it was a little bit. And they ended up profaning it in their own way a little bit by not allowing people to not allowing Jesus to heal on the Sabbath and different things, or not wanting him to.
I've always thought, and I actually mentioned rest in my book, that really the key to rest, or what's behind rest, is it's an act of humility. I think taking a Sabbath is also why it's so important, as the Lord is telling us to. I think it's an act of trust and an act of humility to realize, okay, it's not all up to me. Like I can surrender here one day. And even a mindset and a disposition of our hearts as well. It doesn't have to just be a physical day, it's both, but just to remember too, it's an act of trust, an act of humility, we're laying down our work to say he's got this, and it's in his hands. I do what I can, but I'm not God. To remind us too of who we are and who he is.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for bringing us that to us, because I totally agree. Sometimes it is hard to take a Sabbath and to just rely on God to help you get your work done throughout the week. It's hard. It really is.
Oh, yeah.
But Liz, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. This was a lot of fun. I appreciated meeting you and your willingness to come on, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And like I said before at the beginning of this podcast, I'll definitely drop a link in the bio of this podcast episode to Liz's book, The End of Me, which is available on Amazon, and then also where you can read some of her blog posts or connect with her a little bit at lizwann.com. And like I said, that'll be in the show notes. But friends and faithful listeners, happy listening and God bless.